Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Collins, LLC.
Mr. Temple mentioned that I'm from Detroit. When I was 15 years old, there was a civil unrest in the city before the King assassination, a year before, the summer of '67. And from my house in the city, I could see the fire and smoke of that was going downtown about 8 or 10 miles away. That was how the sky had darkened. You could not live in Detroit as a young man and not think about race. I played basketball, not very well. I played on a team that was about half black, half white. The school at that time was 75% white. I'll tell a story about one of my teammates that had a profound effect upon me. His name was Mike Holt. He was the state 440 champion, the 440 track champion. He was a better runner than he was a basketball player, but we were friends. And I said to him, he lived in an area of the city that was predominantly black, and I said, Mike, I want to come down to your neighborhood and hang out with you. And he said, you will not do that. And I said, why? It was not what I thought. I said, because I already got a lot of crap for coming to this white school. And if you come to my neighborhood, I will get more crap. And that's one of the things that told me that I can't see the world through my eyes. I have to see it through other people's eyes. To see it through other people's eyes is the essence of being a journalist. Journalists are nothing but a bunch of thieves and borrowers. We ask people questions and borrow their words all day long to write our articles. And I had edited or written stories in which race was a central component throughout my career, and yet I still felt that I had only scratched the surface of understanding the way people who are white and people who are colored see the issue of race. I applaud the new book by Dr. Ibram Kendi I recommended to you. He won a National Book Award for his first book called Stamped from the Beginning, about the history of racism in America. He's written a new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And one of his arguments is it's not good enough to say, I'm not racist. Racism is so pernicious, you must oppose it, you must be an anti-racist. It's hard for journalists to be that vigorous because we are the ones standing on the sidelines describing things. We are not the activists. I hope that answers your question. That's part of the motivation. I also read a book. I read a book when I was young that I admired very much. I recommend it to you as well if you haven't read it. It's called Gideon's Trumpet. And it's about the Gideon versus Wainwright case that provides lawyers for people that poverty is not a reason not to have a lawyer. So when you get furnished an attorney, if you are accused in a criminal matter, it's because of Gideon versus Wainwright. This is a marvelous book about one Supreme Court case and its window on America. And I thought when I was about 20 years old, I'd like to write a book like that someday. Now, Mr. Lewis, Anthony Lewis, who wrote it, I think he was in his 40s when he wrote it. I had to wait until I was in my 60s to write my version of Gideon's Trumpet. So he beat me to the punch. He also, I think, would criticize me for taking 500 pages. I think Gideon's Trumpet is only 300. So if you need to choose a book, you can choose his rather than mine. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, I only know my history piecemeal, but I always associate the Plessy court with the actions of Andrew Johnson and the appointments he made after the Civil War. But then you're telling me that most of the Plessy court ignored it. So talk about...
All right, so I'll talk a little bit more about it. The question was about, he had always associated the Plessy court with Andrew Johnson and the impeachment that took place in 1868. Harlan was the first Southerner to be appointed to the court since before the Civil War. The first Southerner to be appointed to the court since the war. He was appointed in 1877. He was appointed by President Rutherford B. Hayes, who had become president after the disputed election of 1876. And Hayes had promised in the election, when I say promised, he did not go out and stump like our candidates do today. That's not the way campaigns took place then. In those days, you had proxies who were speaking on your behalf. But one of the things that Hayes had said in his various public speeches was, I will withdraw the federal troops from the South. The South was still occupied in most places by federal troops. And he made good on that promise. In order to cement the notion that he was really trying to be different than his predecessors, than Grant, he wanted to appoint a Southerner to the court. And he had chosen to do this, and his advisors were appalled that he was thinking of appointing someone from Alabama or Louisiana, because that was too deep in the South. Instead, they said, well, what about this guy Harlan? He's almost a Northerner. He's in Kentucky. And so that's how Harlan had delivered Kentucky's votes to Hayes at the Republican National Convention in 1876. In fact, let me read something. You want to see how a person of color saw the world in 1876. Here's a passage that I want to read to you. This is from Frederick Douglass's convention speech in 1876. Oh, I didn't mark it. Let me just tell you what he said. So he made the point. He was being sarcastic. He said to the conventioneers, now this is largely a white group, you say you have liberated us, and you have, and I thank you for that. You say you have enfranchised us, the 15th Amendment. You have, and I thank you for that. But what is your liberation? What is your enfranchisement if we are subjected to instead of being subjected to the slaveholders' lash, we are subjected to their wrath? So when are you going to make good, he said, on your promises in your Constitution? And it was no accident that he chose the word your, because what he was trying to say in that speech and in many others is, I didn't get a chance to vote for these people. I didn't get a chance to write these constitutions. This is your Constitution. These are your promises. It is your responsibility to make good on those promises. That's how a man of color in 1876 saw the world. So by the 1890s, there had been one Southerner appointed. He was appointed by Grover Cleveland, who was the first Democrat to be elected for a very long time since the end of the Civil War. And by that time, the Republican Party had begun to change its stripes. And if you look at the newspapers and the pronouncements of the day in the 1890s, you will read often a debate in the Republican Party about, it is time to abandon the Negro. They're weighing us down. We're always caught up in the rights question. We need to move on to economic issues. This was a very live debate in the Republican Party of the 1890s. Other questions? See how much time we have. We've got 5 more minutes. Please stand up.
This is purely speculative, but Plessy and the Creole people of color, had they won their case, what do you think would have been their reaction to the people who had been enslaved writing those statements?
Very good question. I mean, one of the things that was very difficult for the committee, the Citizens Committee, to accept is they had written to Frederick Douglass and to ask for his imprimatur, because Frederick Douglass was the most famous black man in America. Of course you would want his imprimatur. And we don't know why, because there are no letters that survive, but Douglass would not give it to them. And my educated guess is he had 2 reasons. Now Douglass was a speaker at a convention in 1883 in which he gave a very rousing speech. You can read this speech in anthologies, sort of saying to the crowd, you must always resist. You must always resist. You must always fight. You should never be quiet. And in the crowd was a young man named Louis Martinet from Louisiana. He was a delegate to the convention. And he remembered this speech, of course, and he was fighting in the 1890s. So he was furious when Douglass wouldn't give his imprimatur. And I think there were 2 reasons. One is that Douglass looked at this group and said, not my constituents. These are a bunch of mixed race people from Louisiana. That's not who I'm interested in. And secondly, that he saw it as a losing case, and he didn't want to be on the side of a losing case. Now, it's really important to think of New Orleans as a unique place. It is today, it was then. I don't think this case, Plessy, could have come out of any other city in the country the way it transpired, because it was the organization and the fundraising and the persistence of the group that kept the case going. had a legal strategy. You had a northern lawyer who was doing his work for free, as it happened, because he wanted to make a name for himself too. But in Savannah and Richmond and Charlotte and Charleston, you didn't have people of color who had yet had the kind of education and wealth accumulation that this group in New Orleans had achieved. Now, even they were elite in their group. There were plenty of people mixed race who were not well off in New Orleans in this era. As to whether Plessy, if the case had been decided differently, it wouldn't have been decided differently. It was an impossibility, I think. But one of the arguments, it's kind of a wacky argument that Turget, the lawyer, offered was he was looking for a winning argument. And he said, race is your property. Race is your reputation. Now, he was doing this, I think, because these 9 white men in the Supreme Court were all beloved defenders of property rights. So he was looking for a property rights argument. And so Turget and his group argued, no conductor has the right to deprive you of your property, your race, your reputation, without due process by walking down the aisle of the railroad car. Well, if the court had bought that argument, they could have very well said, okay, anybody who can pass for white can join the people in the white car, but people who can't pass for white are going to be still in the Jim Crow car. You still would have had separation. So I think that, Martinet saw himself in his letters as a defender of people of color, but he also distanced himself from those people of color, the people who were black, and said that he prescribed a prescription for what they should do to elevate themselves. He was much more militant than Booker T. Washington. He didn't really think Booker T. Washington's view was the right one. But he also distanced himself and said, I don't consider myself to be a part of that group that is far more, less educated and less wealthy than I am. Got time for one more question.
What reasoning did the Plessy Court have for rejecting the argument from the 13th Amendments? Because once you have the 14th Amendments, it seems that the 10th no longer required.
Well, that's where Justice Brown gets into a lot of trouble. On the 13th Amendment, he just said it was a slavery amendment, and since slavery wasn't a part of this case, he ignored the badge of servitude argument. That was where he left it. On the 14th Amendment, he gets into trouble because he gets into the heads of the people who passed the amendment and wrote the amendment and said they couldn't have meant, and he uses a phrase that is not a legal phrase, in the nature of things, that people from differing races ought to be together. They couldn't have meant that. And he uses a phrase that Harlan rips into him for, a phrase that was often thrown up by people who wanted to derail the conversation and said, there is no such thing as social equality. The idea that you could sort of make black and white people have dinner together or something. And Harlan, because he used those terms, social equality, Brown did, Harlan said, stop talking about social equality. No one's talking about social equality. This is a railroad. It's on a public highway. It's funded by public funds. It's for the benefit of the entire public. And that's the way they had the argument. And this idea of the public highway is one that Harlan returns to repeatedly in his dissent because he's trying to get it away from, let's stop talking about having dinner or who's going to marry whom. We're not talking about those issues here.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Collins, LLC.